facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park and have been made possible in part by Ravinia Festival, CJE, Senior Life, GAN Music and Sound.
And welcome to Cahnmann's Current Events Roundtable. Today we have a show that I've never done before about a plane crash that was Flight 232 that crashed in Sioux City, Iowa 25 years ago. And I have two wonderful guests. I'm very, very privileged of having them on my show and welcoming back Laurence Gonzales. He's the author of Flight 232, which was 1819 Uniform, and a story of disaster and survival, and Rod Vetter, the United Flight 232 survivor. And welcome, guys. I'm going to shake your hands both at the same time. It's really a privilege of having both of you on the show. And I want to read an opening because I think our viewers would really understand this a little bit better of what happened. And by the way, this is a story of disaster and survival, and this is Laurence Gonzales' book, Flight 232, and all the information that we're going to be doing on the show comes directly from this book. Laurence interviewed all the survivors, and that was a heavy-duty thing that you did. And as hundreds of rescue workers waited on the ground, United Airlines Flight 232 wallowed drunkenly over the bluffs northwest of Sioux City. And they were coming in from Denver to Chicago. The rescuers didn't move at first. Nobody could possibly survive that crash. And then people began emerging from the summer corn that lined the runways. Miraculously, 184 out of 296 passengers lived. No one has ever attempted to complete reconstruction of a crash of this magnitude. And Laurence, who is drawing interviews and hundreds of survivors and crew and airport, and he did on rescue personnel and all the people that survived. Laurence, most of them he got, some of them he didn't, but this book is filled with wonderful survivors that were able to tell their story, and so much. Rod Vetter, I'm happy you're here today.
I'm happy to be here.
So Laurence, let's get to the book a little bit, and also we had you on the show for Deep Survival, Who Lives and Who Dies and Why, and Survival. Oh my goodness, all these surviving things. How did you come up with it? And you're the big guy on survival. How do you think about these things? What made you want to write this book?
This is a unique crash in that it was a fiery crash. The airplane broke up and burst into flames, and yet 184 people, as you said, survived it. We rarely get to see a fatal crash from the inside out, but because of the nature of this one and because of special circumstances, we were able to talk to people like Rod and really find out, well, what is it like when you're in the middle of this? I've been a pilot most of my life. My father was a pilot, combat pilot in World War II. And so I've always been interested in aviation, and I had been writing about airline safety since the 70s. And so this just seemed like an irresistible opportunity.
Wow, that is, I read this book and my heart was pounding as I was reading this book. It was so traumatic, and yet it's so well written, and I felt like I was there. I could really feel myself there, and I felt myself there talking to a survivor, Rod. You were actually there, and you brought with us to the program today your passport.
I brought a passport that was delivered to me by United Airlines a month or so after the crash.
Oh wow! Look, and
All burned.
burnt and charred, but look at it's still there, and there's your picture. Oh my goodness!
And this was in my briefcase, and this was a business card. In fact, there's my driver's license. And this was just totally burned up, and United was kind enough to send that to me.
Oh my
A
God!
month or so later.
How did they find it was yours? I mean,
I think they probably looked at the driver's license and
and it was still intact
yes,
after. Oh,
still is.
oh my God! I'm gonna give this back to you. This is like a remnant. This is it's history. I don't want to touch it. I don't want anything to happen to it. That is really something. What is it like to be in an airplane crash? And I know some of your survivors relived a lot of them. Some of them, there was a survivor that I met at a talk that you gave recently down in the city, and he cannot go on airplanes anymore, but you still fly.
I do still fly, yes.
And what was that like for you?
Well, we had basically 40-some minutes of anticipation. It was actually very calm. I thought the flight crew did a fabulous job. And the flight crew doesn't know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And we as passengers certainly didn't know what was going to happen. But it was very peaceful, very quiet, very organized.
Mm-hmm. But you know, I read in the book, the way Rod's talking now, but as Laurence wrote in the book, Rod Vedder found himself hanging upside down from the seatbelt with the bulkhead collapsed onto your row of seats, and because the cabin was inverted, you were above the bulkhead, and you opened your eyes, you saw fire, smoke, and a hole on the floor which was now above you.
Yeah.
And you reached for the nearest exit, and you also, it looks like that you helped other people. It wasn't just yourself that you were getting out, but Laurence puts down that you had other people keep going, but you stayed behind.
I actually helped some gentlemen that were trying to get Sister Vianney, who was a nun from here in Chicago. They were having trouble getting her out of the airplane, and I assisted them in getting her out, and then I went back in with another flight attendant. We tried to find anyone else that we could help get out of the airplane.
Wow, that's very heroic. And you wrote everything about all these people, Laurence. Maybe you could tell a little bit of stories. I think there was a story you mentioned about Tim Owens, who is a flight attendant.
Yes, that was the flight attendant that you went back in with. Tim was a fairly new flight attendant at the time, and he was sitting in approximately the middle of the airplane before the crash. And as you probably know, the flight attendants face backwards. They're in jump seats that
Right.
are behind the regular seats. So Tim was in his jump seat preparing for the crash, and the flight attendants began yelling for people to take up the brace position, which is bend down and grab your ankles. And so all the heads in his section of the plane went down, so the plane looked completely empty to him. And way at the end of the row, he could see where Susan White, another young flight attendant, was sitting in her jump seat, and she was facing the rear toward the lavatories, and he couldn't really see her because she was behind a seat, but he could see her elbow poking out because she was bracing herself like this. And when the plane crashed, Tim was watching, and as he watched, the entire tail of the airplane cracked off and disappeared.
Oh my God.
So where he's watching down this aisle, where his good friend Susan White is sitting there, all of a sudden she's gone, these rows are gone, and as the tail breaks off, it bends and crushes part of the fuselage and starts ejecting rows of seats either high up into the air or down onto the runway. And the plane was going about 250 miles an hour at that point.
Well, why was it going so fast?
Because-
what happened to the, maybe you could tell our viewers what exactly happened to the airplane that it made it go that speed?
Well, the center engine, the DC-10 has 3 engines, one on each wing and one through the tail. And that engine going through the tail exploded in cruise flight, and pieces of that engine went through the tail and cut the hydraulic lines. The hydraulic lines are what give the plane its steering. So without hydraulic fluid, there's no steering at all.
Oh.
It's completely unsteerable. And the plane was in the process of rolling over like this, and it was going to dive 7 miles to the ground and kill everyone. And at that moment, the captain, Al Haynes, reached over and gave the right engine all the thrust and retarded the throttle on the left engine so that all the thrust was on the right side. And so instead of rolling all the way over, it began coming up like this, and he saved the flight from crashing. Then they realized, of course, that they could control the plane slightly by using these throttles that way. And that's, in fact, what they did for the next 44 minutes and 13 seconds.
Did you know, Rod, did you realize at that time that the airplane was in trouble? Or was it, because sometimes you think it's just turbulence, because a lot of times they'll say, get back in your seatbelt. There's, a little bit turbulence. And, did you know that there was something wrong with that airplane?
We'll take it from when the engine blew up. And my first thought was it's a bomb. And
So you actually heard an explosion?
We absolutely heard it and felt it. But after realizing that we still have compression and there's no decompression, that wasn't the case. So I said, okay, we must have blown an engine, which DC-10s can fly perfectly on one engine, and let alone 2. So my first thought was, okay, we're just going to go right into Chicago and be there on time. And then we began to see that we weren't going in a straight line, but as a passenger, I don't know that you really want to know all the details.
So but if it can run on 2 engines, Laurence, why didn't it run on 2 engines?
Well, it did run on 2 engines. The thing is, it had no steering. So you can imagine being in your car and you're going 50 miles an hour on cruise control, and suddenly you've got no steering. The car is going to wander all over the road, which is exactly what this airplane did. As they were trying to control it with the throttles, the plane kept wanting to turn to the right, because when the engine blew, most of the damage happened to be on the right side. So it was like putting a paddle into the water in a canoe. The plane just kept turning and turning, and they were fighting it with the throttles. But if you look at the radar track of what the plane did, it actually went around and around and around all over the state of Iowa before they finally came down at Sioux City.
You just mentioned something that I just thought about right this second. I was in a car with my children in it. It was my old station wagon. My children were very small, and I had no brakes. And I was driving on the on Eden's Expressway without. I lost brakes, and I had to steer it till I finally got to the. On the right-hand lane until it finally stopped on its own. It was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. And right this second, Laurence, and when you were talking about the airplane, I just remembered it. I think it was something that I put out of my mind because it frightened me, especially not because of myself only, because my children were in the car, and I think I had another child that was in the car, was a friend of one of my kids. So I had 3 little kids in the car at that time, and that is very, very frightening. So I can imagine you're up in the air and you have no way to steer, and
your children were in car seats.
And I'm not quite sure. They were strapped in. They didn't have the car seats in those days. They were just in the car seats with the, around the waist. Remember, those were the cars. That was the
Right.
safety.
Well, in Flight 232, there were 50 children on board, and a number of them, because United was running a special for children that day, and a number of those children had no seats. They were forced to sit in the lap of their parent.
Yes.
And 2 of those children died as a result of that policy.
And isn't there they're trying to get the law into effect, because there's a lot of people, after I read your book, my son just had a little, she has a little girl. He has 3 boys and a little girl, and they live overseas right now. And he was going to come in with them, and he was going to hold the 1-year-old. And I said, absolutely not. I don't care what the price is. That child's getting a seat. And I think you need I think that Jan Brown, who was one of the flight attendants, she's the head flight attendant, right? Senior flight
Right.
attendant, and she's been advocating for seat belts, for seats for every child. If they're 2 months old, 1 month old, doesn't matter. Every child that has a seat is much safer, because also there's turbulence in an airplane too. That child could get thrown.
Right. Well, I met at the 25th anniversary of this crash, I met a couple of kids who were kids on board that had seat belts. And their counterparts who did not have seat belts, I didn't meet because they died.
Oh my God. Why don't they have seat belts now? I mean, they have enough information knowing that there's, that this happens for lap babies.
Jan Brown and the people she works with on this issue have gone to the FAA repeatedly, and the FAA refuses to change the law. So until enough babies die, the FAA won't act.
Oh my God.
So a smart parent will simply forget about what the law says and bring a safety seat for your child when you fly.
That means they have to buy a seat.
You have to buy a seat, that's correct.
But if they know ahead of time, if they buy a seat, that child will be saved, even if it wasn't a crash.
Fairly inexpensive insurance.
That's right. And I think people need to be aware, and this is why we're doing this show as well, is to bring a lot of these things aboard, and so people will understand what they need to do. Also, maybe Laurence and both of you could discuss Gary Brown, who, thank God for Gary Brown, because he had a disaster plan. He tell a little bit about Gary Brown and his disaster plan, and why this flight possibly, why you're still around, and people from Malaysia Airlines probably aren't around because of this wonderful disaster plan that he put into effect.
It was several years before this crash that Gary began advocating for the community, which they call Siouxland, it's the area around Sioux City, to get together and organize to respond to a disaster. And he wanted to simulate the crash of a jumbo jet. And everybody in the community said, "You're nuts, Gary. Jumbo jets don't land at Sioux City, and this is all Chicken Little stuff." And they made fun of him. And he finally persisted, and through the fire department and the hospitals, got a simulated jumbo jet crash exercise at the airport. And in fact, it was right on the spot where this plane crashed that he had this exercise.
Isn't that something?
It was in 1987, 2 years before this crash. But as a result of his planning, and the community's planning, but his leadership, they were ready for this when it came in. And they were able to save many, many lives that would have been lost otherwise.
Do you remember, Rod, that these people came to help you?
Oh, absolutely. I remember exiting through the hole in the side of the airplane, and I could see fire trucks, I could see National Guard people wandering around with backboards trying to help people, and it was just a matter of minutes, it seemed like, after the crash.
Wow. So you were able to get through a hole. There was somebody, I remember in the book that you wrote, there was somebody that actually went through, he jumped through the fire.
Yes, Charles Martz was sitting near the rear of the plane, which was a very bad place to be because of the wind blowing the fire into that area. And when he, of course the plane was upside down, he was hanging from his seatbelt, and when he popped his seatbelt and fell to the ceiling, he couldn't see, he couldn't breathe, there was too much smoke, and he thought, "I'm going to die in here." And he saw fire off to the side, fairly close to him, and he thought, well, I would rather get third-degree burns than just sit here and die. So he ran toward the fire, and he actually jumped into the fire. And the next thing he knew, he was standing on the runway in the bright sunshine, completely unscathed. He had on a suit, he had his tie still straight, he had his pencil in his pocket, and he had not a scratch on him. And in fact, a man in a truck at that moment, because as Rod said, all these rescuers were milling about, a man in a truck pulled up to him and said, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. Where did you come from?"
So he didn't believe that he was a survivor?
He didn't believe that he had come off the plane.
I saw people that looked like they had stepped out to go to a prom. not a hair out of place, perfectly clean. No, just I couldn't believe they were on the airplane either.
Mhm.
And then other people were obviously not so fortunate.
So you saw all kinds of
Oh, yes.
disaster body parts, all kinds of horrific things.
Mm-hmm.
Has that affected you in your...
You know,
do you ever
I
have
would-
any flashbacks? Because I was reading, there were several people, that were in Lawrence's book that they talked about flashbacks that one person doesn't fly anymore, another person gets flashbacks, and what do you feel any?
I still fly. I think it's still the safest method of transportation. I do have flashbacks. I went through a period of post-traumatic stress, and I had a lot of help getting through that. And I remember driving downtown and driving under a bridge on the Edens Expressway. And I'm looking up at this bridge and I'm going, wow, I don't know if this bridge is going to stay up while I'm driving by it. And just things that don't make a lot of sense.
Do you ever feel like if you're in turbulence on the airplane, do you get nervous about it? If you're,
No.
so
no.
you pass that.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, and some people weren't as
But I keep my seatbelt
fortunate.
on.
You keep it through the whole flight. Yeah, I always worried if I had to use the facilities. Oh my God, I get stuck in that little. What do you do? What actually? The plane. What was the reason for the crash? What actually happened? What was their? What we still have a few minutes that we can talk
Can
about.
do a little forensic analysis for you.
Yes.
So if you go out to the airport and look at a jet airplane, you'll see that there's a big fan on the front of the engine. It has all these fan blades sticking out. Those fan blades are attached to a disc in the middle that spins, and the disc is made of titanium, a special metal called titanium, which is the same stuff you get your prosthetic hips made out of.
My knees, and
yes,
a
your
titanium knee.
And titanium is very tricky to make, and when they made this titanium disc from that airplane, it had a defect in it. And over a long period of time, the defect cracked and cracked and cracked, little bit at a time, until finally on this day it let go and sprayed all those fan blades out, and that's what cut the hydraulic lines. Without the hydraulic lines, as we've discussed, there was no steering, and so they didn't have proper control of the plane. That's a flaw of the DC-10, by the way, that those hydraulic lines were so close together. So when they came in to try to land, it was an imperfect attempt, and there was no way for them to make it perfect. The right wing struck the runway, and as the right wing broke, all of the fuel came out, and the plane was going 250 miles an hour, because without hydraulics, you can't put the flaps and slats out on the wing to slow the plane down. So at 250 miles an hour, you get all this fuel turning into an aerosol. It's a mist now, and it ignites instantly into this giant fireball. And incidentally, your viewers can watch this happen on a video that was taken. If they go to flight232.com, that website will show them this video, flight232.com. And you can see, it looks like no one could possibly survive. But that's what happened to the plane.
Oh my God. And what are they doing now to prevent they're no longer, this plane, I thought, until you corrected me before, I thought the plane was only, the DC-10s were used only for cargo, and I think you said that they're used out of the country?
they're used out.
They just actually had the last flights of scheduled passenger DC-10s, and I believe it was about a year ago, last summer.
Did they take them off?
That there are no scheduled airline flights of DC-10s. DC-10s are being used for cargo, and they have been in the past anyway used for special flights. For example, they were ferrying soldiers to and from Iraq and Afghanistan for a while.
With DC-10s?
With DC-10s, yeah.
With this, they knew about the error, and they still allowed it to fly?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, you'd have to ask the FAA or the international aviation bodies, but I just want to make the point that flying is the safest method of travel. It's safer than walking. More people get killed walking down the street than flying in a scheduled airliner. And so Rob doesn't worry about flying on an airplane, and neither do I.
But remember, something happened to you, what was it, in
79.
79.
So it helps to know things.
Yes.
And I started studying the DC-10 in about 1972, and in
Why? Why did
Well,
you...
because it had flaws in it. It was a
how
plane.
did you know it had flaws in it?
Because it kept crashing.
Ah.
It crashed. At the time, it was the only airplane that distinguished itself by falling out of the sky of its own accord. There were airline crashes for various reasons, weather, something falls off the plane, but pilot error, birds. But the DC-10 was just falling out of the sky, and it drew my attention, and I indeed discovered that it had some serious flaws. In 1979, some colleagues and I were going to go to a book convention. We were going to leave Chicago on May 25th of that year, and I found out that they had booked themselves on a DC-10. And I said, I'm not going because I don't like the DC-10, and I'll either skip it or I'll reschedule or something.
You couldn't talk them out of it, huh?
Well, I didn't try to talk them out of it. I just said, this is my decision. And they actually made fun of me, like, the aviation guy doesn't like the DC-10. But I did not go. The flight was American Flight 191, and it lasted 31 seconds.
Oh, my God.
And crashed into an open field, and everyone was killed. So I had always kind of had my radar out for the DC-10 anyway when I decided to write this book.
Is your radar out for any other airplane right now? Because I got to take 3 flights to 3 different places.
I don't like the Airbus as much as I like Boeing products. So the 7 series, 737, 747, 757, and so on. I like those planes a lot. They're very good planes. The Airbus has some problems that I disagree with, and so if I have a choice, I'll fly Boeing.
Well, before we book these and before I go on, I'm going to tell you all the planes that I'm going on. So you have to listen to him a lot, right? Did you notice, what were you wearing? Because you have, in one of these articles one of the chapters that I was reading, one of the men that was wearing, he was, what was his name? Transu. John Transu had saved his life by not wearing, he was wearing leather shoes, he was wearing long pants, he was wearing cotton.